Hi, everybody, and we are live. So I'm joined by Dr. Matt Lungren, who's at CES, I believe, this week. If you've seen these monthly thought leadership interviews before, we usually jump right into questions on the assumption that, we're on LinkedIn Live after all, so you could glance at Matt's LinkedIn. But we were chatting a bit before we went live, and I think a quick glance at your LinkedIn might be a little bit misleading because you maintain multiple roles. And I think those other roles in some aspects of your background, even for instance, that you were a lit major before before medicine. I think some of those details will really inform the conversation. So I'm actually going to suggest that we start there, talking a little bit about your multiple roles and how you navigate that.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Yeah, thanks for having me, and welcome to everybody who's joined. We talked a little bit about this, and I've covered this in a few other venues, but I do wear several hats. I obviously my main role is here at Microsoft, and I'm kind of responsible for some of the bi-directional, bringing innovation that's happening either at MSR with our partners or collaborators, and finding a way to purpose fit that for for healthcare use cases. And then as a bi-directional, so like if there's a problem or a challenge we're seeing in healthcare, can I bring that and sort of speak the right language to the innovation side of the house, so the core research, obviously some of the great work that's going on with with deep learning and generative AI, and can we find a way to solve that with technology? And so it's a super fun role, but as part of that, as you can tell, I live, eat, breathe, sleep healthcare, right? That's been the basis of my career for so long, and at least that it's pretty easy to lose sight of the reality of healthcare as it's currently practiced. The things that we face on the ground, some of the technology gaps that still exist, right? I think people would be surprised to know that even in modern healthcare systems, we still have fax machines, right? So there is some of that too, and I think that at least for me, that's really important. And then again, I spent the better part of 25 years training and practicing, and I love what I love that part of my identity. I love treating patients and being a part of the workforce. So that's always been important. And then as you probably also sort of notice, there's an academic lens to this too, which is, if you're going to teach something, you kind of have to learn it really well yourself. And so being able to sort of work with students and things via my role at Stanford has also been great to kind of keep a finger on the pulse of innovation, me promising young talent that has a lot of great ideas, maybe, and potentially help nurture that. So a lot of things going on in my day to day, but overall, I think it, as a cadence, it tends to all blend pretty well together.
Well, and I would imagine your interaction with younger doctors and doctors that are still in training puts a whole nother side to this as well, because there's probably a certain amount of just fear of the unknown and anxiety about what medicine will look like in 10 years. If you were 100% on the technology side, that would change pretty quickly. I mean, even year to year. I should mention to the audience, because I really recommend that they check this out as a resource, the YouTube channel at Amy, the center at Stanford for AI and medical imaging. That's how I first encountered you, and really put on some really great online webinars that as someone coming in that doesn't have a background in medicine, I found that those were really, really an amazing resource.
Yeah, I mean, the Amy Center is tremendous. I mean, we weren't the first to think of this, but when I was full-time faculty at Stanford, what I started to realize pretty early on, at least, with all the deep learning excitement that was happening around 2012, 2013, as you recognize, the computer vision really took off, and then that kind of led to a lot of innovation that moved into healthcare. There was still this, I always call it like a junior high school dance, where like there's the computer scientists on one side and the clinicians on the other, and they didn't know how to interact with each other. They wanted to dance, but they didn't really have the right forum, or maybe they didn't know how to talk to each other. And so the Amy Center was really set up in a way to say, there's some great ideas in healthcare. There's some really amazing innovations in computer science. How do those things start to fit together? And then cross education, right? So clinicians, let's get them beefed up on, data science, computer science, at least to the point of understanding the principles. Not necessarily they don't have to, pull up a Python notebook and start coding, but to be fair, a lot of them did, by the way. And then on the other side, you spend some time with the clinicians, shadow them in clinic, do some deep dives with their problems and use cases. And, you find that a lot of people have superficial assumptions, as you would, that quickly get wiped away when there's deep collaboration. And that's kind of where the Amy Center started. And then we said, we should really try to bring this culture and sort of spirit to the broader community. So that was the genesis behind some of the open source work we did, obviously the YouTube channels. We've really tried, even with data sets, by the way, which are difficult for data scientists outside of health systems to get a hold of. We've really tried to make that available too. And we've seen the innovation just skyrocket as a part of that. So yeah, I'm glad you called that out.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned the data sets too, because some of my practitioner colleagues are going to love that as a resource. I actually found the report on the Amy website, kind of a retrospective going back from 2018 and some of the accomplishments, and it has a whole page on the data sets. So we could even put that in the group chat now, because I had prepared that link. Yeah, I love the school dance metaphor, because as consultants, that's basically the difference between a data scientist and a data science consultant in many ways. Is if you're going to be an effective data science consultant, you have to be able to navigate that, even though you're working in areas where you're never going to be an expert like the subject matter experts are. You have to lean on each other, quite heavily. And, there's always a little bit of myth breaking coming from the other side, from someone that might be an expert in their field, but not know quite as much about AI, so there's some of that going on. By the way, I was really enjoyed the keynote that you did for Amy. I guess it was just a few months ago, because what you were talking about was, if you went back to 2021, as recent as that was, folks were still talking about, certainly what I was reading and what I was thinking, long haul truckers, for instance. I don't know if you happen to recall, there was a book that came out on that topic. As a generalist, I have to look into all these areas, but that was one of the things that was being talked about quite prominently around that time, that long haul trucking was going to be one of the areas that was going to have jobs hit the first. And of course, driverless cars haven't gotten quite where we thought they would get in 2025 based on what we were predicting 5 years ago. But no one was saying white collar, jobs. And of course, that's what's happened. I love that you, I'm sure you remember this, but your talk, you mentioned a roustabout. We're a very super physical, dangerous job in the oil industry, and AI is not going to touch that. But they aren't, of course, touching things like medicine, which is why we're here. It's changing quite rapidly. So let's get back to the dance, because that was my first question after introductions here. As consultants, we have to work with a lot of subject matter experts, but medicine is possible. Oh, that's Christy, by the way, who just provided that comment, is a PhD in computational linguistics who is on our team. And that's interesting, because that's going to be another question when we get to medical transcription and natural language processing. I'm sure some of my conversations with her will come up again. But the thing about medicine is there's just something about medicine, I think, that's a little bit more intimidating, I think for good reason, but a little bit more intimidating from somebody on the outside, that probably makes that high school dance even more challenging than, let's say, marketing analytics or some areas that maybe don't, that also absolutely have subject matter expertise, but that might not be as intimidating to a data scientist working with a subject matter expert. What do you think doctors need to know about folks like us, AI folks, and vice versa?
Yeah, we talk about kind of the understanding some of the concepts and principles. I think there's a general curiosity. Physicians are, we're smart people, we're well-educated people. We're used to dealing with complex things, and a lot of that has to do with just, our day-to-day work. But then behind all that clinical work is a whole nother layer of, interaction with different software applications, different diagnostic tools, and then also trying to keep up with what is essentially like an avalanche of new information. That's a physician's life, right? They I think recently I heard a statistic that medical knowledge as a whole doubles every 90 days. And we all subspecialize, and then in my case, subspecialize in order to really maintain our domain expertise and really keep up with exactly where the field is. But it's increasingly hard to do across the board. And so for physicians then to sort of now try to take on a new field, which you could argue before Gen AI was certainly accelerating in terms of the amount of information you need to keep up on, the techniques. But nowadays, I don't know anyone, no matter how accomplished they are in computer science, that is able to fully keep up with the amount of innovation that's happening. It is staggering. And so it's an additional challenge for physicians. And so what I was hoping to do, and I think a lot of my colleagues sort of have taken this approach, is if we can sort of start to grok some of the concepts and principles. And my best analogy for this was in as radiologists, we have to learn medical physics, and we don't have to like build an MRI machine, but we have to be able to know, like, okay, if I tweak this gradient, this is going to be the result of that. Conceptually, if I'm looking at an image, this is probably the physics concept that is causing the image to look this way, like those kinds of things. And we're very effective that way. We can invent new imaging protocols just based on our conceptual understanding. Again, we're not getting in the factory floor and creating the machine. So there's a similar analogy here. And I think a lot of the principles, despite the rapid evolution in the technology today on the data science side, I still feel like some of those core principles, particularly if you can be bilingual, really can make you effective. And again, we're talking about two populations of people, generally data scientists and physicians, who are curious, intelligent, well-read, and I think there's just a huge willingness to work together.
The 90-day figure, obviously I knew the volume of information on both sides, the computer science side and the medical side, is kind of staggering, but I hadn't heard that doubling in 90 days figure. How many hours a week do you think physicians have to read papers and those kinds of things just to somewhat keep up with their specialty?
Yeah, it's really challenging. I mean, so, we have, continuing medical education, right, which is typically tied to a lot of the sort of the professional bodies. So your cardiology societies, your radiology societies, and then there's the larger groups too, where you kind of come and gather, and, you kind of basically 2 or 3 solid days, maybe even a week of updating, new information, learning. Sometimes there'll be some quizzes associated with that. So we kind of keep up at a general level, but to really be a true sub expert, you're going to need to spend, several hours a week, if not more, just to kind of keep a finger on the pulse of what your field is or what direction it's going. And then remember, part of that too is not just, taking in the information, but also making a judgment as to whether that information is it trustworthy? Did they do this? Did they do the study well? Are there conflicts of interest? Is this journal reputable? Like, all those things have to get factored in, as we start to, particularly after we graduate, start to figure out what's our plan for maintaining some relevance, at least, or up to date research. And, for me, I've struggled with this over the course of my career. And again, I'm in a small specialty, but part of it is, really just having a system. And this is one of the reasons why I'm, when we talk about some of the use cases in healthcare, how do we unburden our physicians from some of the mundane documentation tasks or the mundane tasks that do not require them to be scientists, do not require them to be experts, in order to give them time to either do these things or, frankly, just have some time back for their lives.
We're definitely gonna talk about that. There's a phrase that we like to use it further a lot. Make AI boring. Basically, in other words, take an existing need. Yes, it's great to go chasing after something new, but take an existing problem and address that first, then go for maybe some of the more aspirational stuff. But to briefly go back to the keeping up issue, because we'll talk about the paperwork soon enough. How on earth is a doctor going to be able to do what you just described on top of their other responsibilities and have even an hour a week to read, some AI thing on LinkedIn or HBR or something like that. I mean, we mentioned, trying to be bilingual. It must be awfully hard for them to keep up with what's going on in AI. So for most physicians, that's probably kind of a surface level thing because they've got to do so much work in their specialty. So how can folks like us, when we meet a subject matter expert? I remember, for instance, I was talking to a client about a potential gig at an orthopedic hospital, in their particular specialty, and doing that dance that we talked about. If I only had a half hour with them, what gaps do you think I should be focused on filling from their point of view? They know their specialty. They probably have a clear set of what their goal is going to be for what AI can do. But if they're spending a day a week just trying to keep up in their specialty, they probably haven't spent a lot of time thinking or reading about AI.
Yeah, I mean, you raised a couple of points there. I think, first is just the baseline, quantity of work that is it seems to be going up and to the right, for physicians and they're just to practice, and that's led to burnout without question. And we've seen the statistics on that. We have an aging population. A lot of physicians are retiring early. A lot of physicians are looking for other ways out, really, frankly, and yet we have an aging population that needs care. So we will have, if not soon, if not now, then soon, a pretty significant crisis. So we do need to think about how we bring in technology to help deal with that. We have some directions, which I'm sure we'll get into. But to your point about how you do the dance, like what's the best use of both of your time? For me, I think it was always having the data scientists spend some time either watching or observing or kind of a day in the life, because it is very opaque. Like, I think a lot of us in healthcare kind of like, of course we do this, and yeah, that's normal. Like, but that's not something that's often exposed unless someone has been through the health system, either as a patient or again, is part of an academic medical center, data science team or health IT, and I think a lot of people, at least in my experience, they come with a few preconceived notions on the data science side. Oh, okay, well, they're going to want me to help them make a diagnosis or something, right? And they come in and they're like, wow, that's actually a small fraction of the work that a physician's doing in their day-to-day. And that kind of realization really does spark that conversation in a meaningful way. But on the other side too, again, we're going to be subject to some of the biases on the clinical side, which is to say that we see all these papers, we see these headlines, AI is amazing, it does all these wonderful things. It just seems like you just flip a switch and all of a sudden it's going to solve your problems. And I think coming to a realization, even just spending some time again with that relationship, recognizing that, okay, well, we can get a demo, we can get back of the napkin use case kind of solved or an architecture put together, but to actually get to the level where it's going to pass the grade for what you would consider a high risk environment is a lot of work too. And so I think that what happens too in some of these relationships, these teams, is the clinical side starts to understand, okay, well, I have a healthier respect for the effort it takes to go from concept to demo to then that huge gap to something that I can actually use in practice. And again, so this is really where that bidirectional education happens. And oftentimes it's just having the relationship. It sounds like, with this orthopedic example, spending a day in the clinic, what are they actually spending their time doing?
Well, yeah, you might have noticed me smiling when you were describing your point of view on that, because that particular client asked me if they needed to get me a pair of scrubs because they asked me if I wanted to actually watch one of the procedures. It was a detailed use case, so I won't get into it now. But I do, when I sit down with clients for the first time, very often one of my first questions is, describe your day. And on occasion, I'll get a surprised look, like that's a rather odd question for data scientists to do. But we make a point to have basically we call it discovery and design, but to basically have a period where that's what the conversation is about, not assuming that the way the client describes their problem in technical terms is going to be what we should follow through on. And that's the classic mistake that most data scientists make. They just assume, oh, the client has described this in machine learning terms, but that subject matter expert maybe, just watched an hour and a half long course or something in machine learning, and they
Right.
did their best to set up the problem, but not to revisit that problem definition is an absolutely fatal mistake. So it's encouraging to hear that our points of view are, I mean, you're about as bilingual as anyone I think I've met in the industry in this regard, but it's helpful to know that looking at it from the standpoint of being a physician, that we see that first few hours of interaction in a similar way. So to get into a use case, and this is one of my favorites. I don't know if you would have picked this as the first one, but I just think it's fascinating. It's the medical imaging and the contrast dye. And there's many things about this that are interesting. So one of them, I think, is that it's about as clear as a use case can be on what the machine's job is and what the physician's job is. The radiologist is still doing what radiologists do, but something that I would have never known. I think this was, you mentioned this in one of your talks, or maybe in the LinkedIn course on, you did an overview with a clever name. I can't think of it now, but it was, but you went all the way back to Fei Li, who I gather you probably know quite well because she's also at Stanford, and ImageNet, and how that all led to these things. But so one thing that I found fascinating, and just going down that rabbit hole a little bit, was that the contrast dye is painful, for the patient, and some patients can't use it. And, as someone that doesn't have a medical background, I had no idea. So that immediately makes it a powerful use case, particularly that some patients can't go that route at all. And then, as I was digging a little bit deeper, folks have been experimenting with that use case before 2012, I guess, earlier than that. So could you just comment a little bit on that use case and what the state of the art is? Because I guess that's been important for quite a few years now.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on, this was a talk I think I gave, this would have been back in like 2016 or something, right? So you have to put your mindset back into this is what we would call the narrow AI days, where you're building models to accomplish individual tasks, and you're trying to find things that align what are often misaligned business and clinical needs, right? So there's the need to have a revenue source and to shorten exam times, for example, in the MRI space. And so there was a variety of companies that kind of sprung up in that era where they were able to shorten the time, for example, that a patient would need to sit in a MRI machine. And a lot of that technology it's generative AI technically, right? It's GANs, generative adversarial networks, but it's not quite the way that we talk about it today. But at that time, it was really, really an exciting thought to say, can I just acquire the base image? So maybe a quicker version of what would normally take, again, 45 minutes, an hour in a magnet. And then can I impute or train a model to add in some of the things that I was, using all that extra time to acquire. So maybe it's another sequence, or as you're pointing out, maybe it's adding contrast to a non-contrast study, which not only does it avoid, again, the challenges that you brought up, of which there are many in the contrast space, but just the overhead that it requires to then, you have to start an IV, you have to have the patient needs to be monitored to inject that contrast dye. So there was all kinds of exploratory research being done at that time. And again, the really beautiful thing about some of that work was really just that you're helping the hospital and the patient at the same time. And that oftentimes that doesn't always line up like that. In other words, the patient's like, cool, I only have to be in this magnet for a half the time that I normally would. And the hospital's like, cool, I can actually get through my backlog of patients who need imaging. And so you're kind of aligning both those incentives with solutions like that. I think a lot of now sort of back with in 2020 today 2025, a lot of that technology ends up getting baked into the machines themselves. But there's a tremendous opportunity to start to take some of these similar kind of alignment to the next level. And this is that idea of this sort of intelligence revolution that we're, kind of coining this new industrial revolution we're calling the intelligence or knowledge-based revolution. And really what that would mean is, can I start to lower the barrier of entry for people to interact with the machine, for the results of that imaging study to be quickly drafted. There's all kinds of operational efficiencies now that can build on top of some of that early work, thinking, how do I make the patient's life better, but also deal with some of the backlog and capacity constraints that we have in the health system. So those early projects, it was astounding what we were able to do with such, compared to now, little compute and little data compared to what we've got now. And again, I often look back. In fact, I look back all the way, even to the 60s as some of the earliest AI folks were kind of coming up with conceptual ways to, leverage AI in healthcare. And they didn't have the capability then, but the ideas were right. And so oftentimes we can sort of take a page out of some of the thought leaders from some of the prior generations and say, okay, well, we actually have the capability. That's not a bad idea. Let's see if we can actually do it.
So so I'm so curious to see how that's changed over the last few years. Then has the image contrast grown to be so effective that it's just kind of a mundane thing that people just assume naturally, or has it gone to like a whole new level? What's the latest with that?
Yeah, for this use case specifically. So I think that because this is a heavily regulated space, there's a lot of things I'm glossing over that I probably wouldn't want to spend the rest of the time on. But just if you're trying to find a happy medium where we are today, it seems like we're kind of moving towards a space where, rather than giving what we would call like a full dose of contrast, we're starting to move into a place where you can give a smaller percentage of that contrast and achieve the same results. And eventually, hopefully, moving to a place where we're able to auto-generate even on the fly. I'm sure the folks in the audience, even if you're not familiar with this particular use case, recognize that the rapid advancements in image generation and frankly, even video generation. How does that translate into something like a medical imaging use case? Well, again, as I was saying before, if you have a base set of data that you've acquired on a patient, can you extrapolate from that in all kinds of different directions, depending on the clinical question, depending on their prior diagnoses? These are kinds of the areas that we're exploring now. Maybe you don't need to give contrast dye in the way that you used to have to do that, and so again, there's lots of areas to explore that go beyond just hey, make a diagnosis with this image.
Yeah, it's incredibly exciting. So the irony is it fits that definition of boring AI in the following sense. It's an existing known problem that everybody understands, right? The radiologists understand it. The patients understand 45 minutes versus 20 minutes in the MRI. So therefore, it has clear, measurable ROI, and that's what makes it exciting. Yeah.
And that's a point that should not be lost. And so again, you could throw a data scientist and a clinician in a room, and they may come out with an awesome use case. But as the sort of the bodies on the field of health AI over the last 15 years will tell you, without that ROI, without understanding product market fit, without understanding health IT and the realities of the financial situation a lot of health systems find themselves in, you can have an awesome thing that still doesn't make it. And I think that's where, again, this team needs to include more than maybe just those two roles. And we talk about that a lot in our Stanford course, which is really to talk about business development and health IT and all these other disciplines that really have to come together.
Well, and you teach the Stanford course in a Coursera form as well, right? As well as we both have some experience with LinkedIn Learning. I love that course in particular because I have coming at it from a different type of expertise. I know how hard it is to get a complicated topic down to 53 minutes.
Well, it was funny because they had come to me. They came to me. This is a funny story. They came to me and they're like, I think we have this gap, but we'd love to. We've seen your course. It'd be great. I said, sure. We can sort of update and modernize it a bit. And they're like, oh no, but there's a catch. You have to do it all in less than an hour. And I'm like, because their market research, which is correct, is just that we all know our attention spans have not necessarily grown, say over the last 5 or 6 years, and then part of that too is being able to. It forces me as the educator to really boil down, and again, that I think that work was valuable. So kind of 3-minute modules, get through it in an hour, a nice overview, and if something really catches your eye, there's plenty of content to go elsewhere to deep dive.
Well, and it's not. certainly attention span is a factor, but if someone knew that their career path was going to be that they were going to be a software developer on a team that was working on medical issues, they would gladly do 8 hours, right?
Yeah.
But for a generalist who really doesn't even know what's going on in medicine and AI, they want that shorter course because they want the first pass through the buffet line, metaphorically. They want to get a sense of what's out there. Anyway, I thought it was a fabulous course. Okay, so one of the ones that you talk about often, and I know is a really big deal. So we were hinting at it earlier. Glancing at my notes here, 34 to 55% of their workday creating notes and reviewing medical records, which sounds horrible, right? And I know that's the opinion of physicians that have to do it as well. So where do we stand with medical transcription? And I guess we can tie in the fact that your work at Microsoft is pretty closely tied to this area. So I know it's an important topic for you. So what's the latest with medical transcription? It may have changed just within the last few months since whatever interview I may have watched recently of yours.
Yeah, no, this is a massive hit. Again, I've been in health AI for a really long time, and there was often again, I kind of hinted at this product market fit idea, which is like, how do we get it in? How does it actually, help the clinician? Do they feel it's valuable? Is it saving them time? All these problems that come downstream with some of the solutions that we can solve X problem, but does it actually drive use, and does it drive the clinicians to basically say, I won't work anywhere that doesn't have this? And this is unequivocally that. I mean, I've talked to clinicians anecdotally that have basically said, I was going to retire until this solution came along, and now my burnout, my satisfaction with working, my ability to connect with my patients are happier. It's just been a game changer. We've, just for the audience who doesn't know this use case. So this is this idea of, and maybe some of you already been to a physician that uses this solution, but basically you walk into your doctor's office, and rather than them sort of, turning to their computer while you're talking to them so they can quickly type notes as you're, having a conversation, they're looking you in the eye in this case, right? Or examining you, and you're having an out loud conversation that's being transcribed. And then at the end of that interaction, that transcription, which is all, a long text file. And again, it doesn't necessarily, your conversation in a doctor's office is not just about your health problem, right? Sometimes you talk about the weather or your cousin's wedding or whatever. All that gets transcribed. And then until now, the technology to take that long transcription with non sequiturs and double back and corrections out loud, how do you turn that into a note that pops up right in the clinician's system of record and allows them to quickly edit and sign, save that time? That was actually one of the brass rings, I would say, in NLP in healthcare for a really long time, is because we know it's a problem, and we'd had to hire humans to do this as scribes. And so what we have today is in this sort of DAX Copilot solution is that conversation happens. The clinician at the end of the visit turns to the computer, and there's the note that has included only the details that are relevant and excluded the things that aren't, giving the physician a chance to sign, make any changes, and then move forward. And that's just the start, right? And we're seeing, again, more than 500 health systems have adopted this solution, on average saving about 50% of their time. And as you pointed out, one of the chief causes of burnout is stuff like this. So if we can have physicians that end their workday on time, are delighted, their patients are delighted, we're seeing this as a massive hit. And the funny thing is this isn't one of those, you call it AI in order to drive adoption. This is really something that, as you kind of mentioned before, it's a boring thing. And the AI component of it is kind of baked in. It's behind the scenes. It's a little bit abstracted, and yet people love it. And we're going to see. We've announced some of the other partnerships with taking this into the nursing realm, doing additional things, with that interaction. You can imagine, and now that we're in the 2025, the year of the agent, there's all kinds of new possibilities with that data, with that interaction to drive even more use or more. Relief for our physician colleagues.
So I have a rather geeky follow-up. So this will be This is going to be back to like the middle school dance. As data scientists, obviously, more often than not, we're trying to predict something. We're trying to build some kind of predictive model. Now, what's powerful about a lot of what Gen AI can do is that just the transcription task in and of itself, even if we didn't try to predict anything, still has some immediately financial value. Plus, if it would extend a doctor's career by a couple of years during a time that there's a shortage, all the better, right? But nonetheless, at some point, somebody's going to take those notes and they're going to want to make a prediction with it. So here's my kind of geeky question. The format that those technologies have to do is probably inspired by billing, because that was the whole reason the doctors were forced basically to pause, and they had to constantly do this because it was all part of care and billing and payer and all that kind of stuff, right? What concerns do you have, if any, about that billing format being how it's structured, and whether that's exactly what you'd want or maybe not exactly what you'd want if the focus was on prediction and care? I'm sure there's an overlap, but I bet it's not a perfect overlap.
No. You're asking the right questions. And again, this is where, the Gen AI boom and all the things that I'm seeing have really kind of broken some of those paradigms that I was sort of thinking of as well. So in other words, does it have to be in this specific format? Well, that's a whole thing, right? I mean, in pre-Gen AI days, formatting data, all the different, right? How many standards do we have? And every time we do a consensus, now there's an additional standard. So like all those challenges that we know about very well in health informatics start to kind of melt away a bit, right? Because if I created a note that was, in a template that the health system needed for their, protocols or whatever, okay. But I can also take that same content and generate a note that is at the 7th grade reading level for a patient. Or I can generate in a way that is meant to be sent to a referring clinician to give them a little bit more insight, maybe leaving out some of the things that aren't relevant, right? That formatting thing starts to be, to me, data becomes dynamic. And we're seeing this even at the lower levels of infrastructure, right? We're talking, it's all these vector databases, right, and embeddings. And really that's just, as you know, a way to store that information as math that you can then resurface in any format or any use case that you feel is useful. So to me, that I think that's one of the exciting things about a lot of this infrastructure shift that's happening, where we're bringing data, the systems of record information closer to intelligence or compute, and then saying, okay, well, I can solve several use cases without having to rebuild an entire new NLP model as we would have had to in the past, because I would have to have a separate one for coding, a separate one for patient friendly. This is more of it may be a prompt workflow thing. It may be a RAG database. There may be some things behind it, but it's not the kind of effort that you are, I'm sure, very aware of in the days of NLP, getting labeled examples and going through this 12 to 18 month development cycle.
Yeah, that's really powerful, because it sounds like, and part of this is your work at Nuance. You can certainly speak to that a little bit if you want. I've got more questions naturally too, but it sounds like this is being anticipated. So the data is being kept in fairly raw form, and it's being prepared for billing. Because the fear would be, I think, in a less enlightened age, there were, for years, what would happen is that you would extract data for one purpose, and then if you wanted to use it for another purpose, there was data lost. But it sounds like that problem is being anticipated with these technologies, that the data is being kept for multiple purposes, one of which is billing. Yeah,
we did this announcement, and I'm not, speaking my book too much here, but at Health, we did an announcement where it talked about this, data fabric, Microsoft Health Data Solutions in Fabric. And Fabric is really meant to say interoperable data platform. Okay, that sounds great. Where does this tie in? Well, if I'm able to store, as we talked about, we can store literally the voice. And even with the voice information, there are innovations that can happen on top of even that data, right? Like you've seen there's even companies now in this space that can take a voice biomarker and say, here's your risk of neurodegenerative disease. Here's your risk of depression. there's all kinds of like what we would call like opportunistic data use that can add more value to the clinical interaction, or frankly, even to the patient's care. We're seeing this all over. I mean, in my world, and more in the, the sort of medical imaging world, this has been known for a while, which is to say that we acquire all kinds of data about a patient with all these imaging devices, ophthalmology and path and derm and radiology, and we kind of use it in the routine care of that patient, and it just kind of gets stored away. And it's like I think the stat is 97% of that data is just in storage. Like, obviously it'll come up again when you visit the health system again, but until then it just sits there. But there is likely insights, as we keep finding out, in that data that wasn't necessarily captured during your encounter. In other words, there's probably some risk predictions that we can do. We can probably do some preventative, care. We can do some preventative referrals for cardiovascular disease or whatever those things are, just based on the data that we've already acquired about you. And how do we actually get that, all interoperable and again, closer to intelligence? And that's kind of the value prop for a lot of health systems that are saying, you know what, we have a lot of data that's not really speaking to each other. We have this technology that's now able to process data in a way that, hasn't been possible before. And how do we get those things plugged in to start driving those use cases?
It's really revolutionary when you think about it, right? Because we've had structured data in healthcare for decades. I wouldn't even want to guess how long we've had some, Epic is, I don't know how long, but there was something before that. But the point is, the structured data, you could go back almost as many years as we've had, IT. But this data that you're talking about now, that's being captured by this medical transcription service, what fraction of all the doctor's notes do you think that is yet? I mean, do you think we're even at 10%?
I actually don't know. I'm sure it's not, close to the majority at this point, but the numbers are basically this, sort of exponential looking curve in terms of, again, I walk just in my day-to-day, I get bumped in, I bump into other clinicians and they're like, hey, wait, you work at Microsoft, right? I'm like, yeah. Hey, my buddy's got Daxscope, he's telling me about it. Can you get me it? Or thank you for working on that, because I love it. And I'm like, I didn't build it, but I'll take credit for it,
Yeah.
But the word of mouth is spreading.
Data scientists love data, right? And if we have to build a model on structured data alone, we'll do it, right? But the text that we're talking about is just ballooning in volume. So what we're able to do in terms of predictive models 6 months from now, or 12 months from now, or 18 months from now will well exceed what we can do now, because this data hasn't just been passively accumulating for years and years. It's really quite new. So, and who knows where that will take us, right? But it's like any source of data. Once you have a lot of it, someone's going to figure out how to get value out of it. But it really is a new thing. It's really remarkable. So I have a different kind of geeky question. So I really enjoyed a podcast that you did as a guest with a young doctor, or a resident. Got a little bit more biographical, and you mentioned being a lit major in Harper's and stuff. So you mentioned something in there that some might have passed by a couple of other folks, but it jumped out at me right away, which is you just made this stray comment with just 4 or 5 words about how you got interested in NLP quite some years ago. I think you said 2007. I jotted it down, doing things like support vector machines. And I think folks will pick up on the significance of that. But just to clarify for them, 2012 is when Fei-Fei Li's ImageNet competition was won by Jeff Hinton's team, including Ilya Sutskever and that whole big thing. So the point is 2007 was before that, right? And as I just mentioned, you were a lit major, and I guess I actually got curious about what Harper's has been saying about AI. I'll ask you about that in a few minutes, because it was actually interesting. Harper's is saying some interesting things about AI. So here's my geeky question on that part of your background, that part of your brain. How did playing around with NLP before we got transformers and these really revolutionary technologies, how does that inform your work now? And then the nature of my question is that Christy, the colleague that I mentioned that asked the question that popped up on screen, she and I have had a number of conversations about this, about how there's a difference between having a Gen AI expert that only knows Gen AI and a Gen AI expert that has been doing computational linguistics and NLP for years before these latest technologies. So you have, it wasn't a specialty of yours, but you were doing this years ago. How do those experiences inform your use of like Gen AI now?
Well, yeah, no, there's a couple of angles here. I think the first is just that, my interest in NLP initially and some of that work, I was very into global health, public health, large data sets, and I was having to manually label to extract insights from unstructured text. And so you might say that my interest in some of the natural language processing approaches to dealing with that was out of laziness or just, exhaustion, right? Because it was very, very difficult, as you can imagine, to use human experts to extract those insights at scale. But I'll be honest, like, I almost feel like it gives me a sense of like continued wonder and gratitude. And I know that sounds a little cheesy, but here's the thing. Like, I think it's almost hard to, I talk about this a little bit in some of my discussions where, there's this book that I sometimes reference, or there's a table in it, which is meant to be a compendium of all about AI, right? And there's this table that talks about all these different tasks that, the caption says, no one in computer science knows how to accomplish these tasks. And it's things like writing an interesting story, having a conversation about an image. And the fact that to most people today, I could walk, down the street today and say, hey, do you know there's this technology that allows you to, have a conversation about an image? You're like, yeah, dude, I know. Yeah, ChatGPT. Well, that was like absolutely impossible to imagine like 4 years ago. And really we're only in this, the second year truly of this quote unquote, ChatGPT's birthday. I have this sense, I kind of once in a while, I take a pause and I realize how incredible this technology really is for those who had suffered in the trenches with a lot of these use cases. And, again, we would be so picky about what we would tackle because we know how much work it took, right? And I'm not to dismiss how much work it still takes, as I mentioned, to get to that final thing, but just to spin up some things and get some reactions at things. We're talking 18 months, sometimes 2 years, especially if it's a grant-funded research project and maybe a team of data scientists, for me to just ask a question: is it possible to reach human level performance for this task, right? And now I can literally, pull up an API key on any of the models, frankly, but having the state of the art model right at my fingertips and start to have these iterations in a day. And those who are using GitHub Copilot and those other solutions, they're able to spin up full working demos because of the code completions and all the other capability. This is just, I just have a constant sense of wonder and gratefulness, honestly, because again, I remember all those years I spent, how much effort it took to build some things that today I might be like, wow, I could have done that in a half a day where it took me 2 years to build.
Well, some of the projects that you're describing, I'm guessing that you might have had 6 months of data prep. You might have had
at least, as you know, it's probably 90% of the time is data prep. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so does it make you trust it more or less, or a combination of both? So
the trust is a big deal. Yeah, no, you're raising an important point. I think, the fact that the solutions that are out, let's take a step outside of healthcare for a second. There's just so much opportunity everywhere you look, no matter what you do for a living, what your industry is. And to have something that, potentially wouldn't give you the result you need or potentially mislead if you're taking it face value, that's a problem everywhere. And it's a problem that's being rapidly addressed. Like, you can kind of look at some of the, sort of macro analyses of, the rate of errors, the ability now to have these frameworks and guardrails. And it's something that we've, even released lots of tools and solutions around to make sure that you can really specify and, trust but verify is what I like to say, as you might with maybe a new intern or something, right? You would trust but verify. I think that dance also is important to keep in mind, right? Like, as we become more familiar with the technology and the use cases, where's that trust but verify happening, and how is it happening is obviously very important. But
how about your colleagues as a community? Where do they fall on that kind of trust or not trust continuum?
It's extremely variable, and obviously my experience is going to be relatively anecdotal. But I have friends that have zero coding background that are spinning up applications on their own. Like, I mean, just to knock out parts of their day to day, or maybe it's something for their own like personal wearable health stuff. I mean, it's incredible what you can do without having a formal background. On the other side, there are folks that are like, listen, I tried it out a few times in 2022, and my kid uses it for their homework or something, but they're not really engaged as much, and it's hard to blame them, right? I mean, you only have so many hours of the day, as we've talked about, but I often say to folks, if you feel like, oh, there's just too much and it's intimidating to try to learn more, the bar has never been lower in my mind, to have someone coming from any domain, but let's just say a healthcare expertise, to kind of start to get familiar with the technology, right? I mean, $20 a month, you spend 10, 15 hours over the course of a few months with the technology yourself, you're going to get an intuition. Okay, this is where I think the capabilities are here. Here's where there might be a gap. And you feel it out, right? And that was hard to do before, right? You had to either learn coding and, start learning all the packages and figuring out what to do, or you had to hire somebody to do that and get that feel that way. So I feel like I see way more clinicians and other domain experts in the healthcare space that are coming to you and saying, okay, well, not only do I have this idea, but here's my proof of concept or demo that I was able to cobble together with essentially, limited coding experience.
Well, and you made an interesting point in a talk earlier this year when you said that somebody might be reading a paper about how accurate Gen AI is, but the study was done on 3.5. And that might be something that maybe some of your colleagues don't look for that detail, but could make a huge bit of difference, because there's a sea change between 3.5 and 4, or other options out there as well, Gemini, Claude, and so on. We sometimes, when we're working on Gen AI for a client, we're sometimes using multiple platforms on that project. There are a lot of reasons that we might have to do that my colleagues could speak to. So I want to do a little bit of housekeeping because we only have a few minutes left. Those of you that are joining us would love to get comments on where you're joining us from. I usually asked that earlier, but better now to ask than not at all. And wonderful time to queue up a couple of audience questions. There's one question in particular that I'd really love to be able to, actually there's two questions I'd love to be able to squeeze in, but if there are audience questions, I definitely want to know about them. And my colleague is helping remind me to check out the newsletter, especially since we had a newsletter come out yesterday that I think you knew was there, Matt. You might not have checked, but so many resources in this area. It could have been basically a big paragraphs of links. I think I cited out to like a dozen things, and I tried to constrain myself to not make it overwhelming. But that was something that impressed me about the LinkedIn Learning course, by the way, as someone that's been through that process myself, having a PDF with all the citations. I thought that was really powerful because who knows how many people chase after those citations, but I know I do. And listening for them and writing them down is really, really tough. Yeah. And there were some really remarkable ones to be able to pull a stat like the half of the day going to paperwork and so on. So here we go. So here's one that I definitely want to get in. So one of the things that sometimes surprises a client when they have a predictive model built is that the whole point typically of doing it is that it's going to save time. And clearly the medical transcription is an outstanding example where that's where the ROI is coming from. I mean, measurable saved hours. But I have a feeling that you've probably encountered this. I know I've encountered it in multiple industries, so I'd be very curious to see if you've encountered medicine. When a predictive model is first rolled out, let's say like the classic AI replacing radiologists by doing the diagnosis directly. And I know that's a whole long story, but with that kind of a model, the workload can actually, in the short to medium term, go up. Right. I was even thinking when you were talking about the contrast in the images, if you can squeeze in more MRIs in a day because they take 20 minutes and not 45 minutes, that's more that someone's going to have to process and do. So have you seen that where sometimes the workload goes up, not down, when the model is accurate?
Yeah, no, that's an incredibly good point. And, I feel like I heard this quote somewhere, but, the US healthcare system is what did they say it was? It was like a, many, breakthrough innovations with a constant obstruction of the misaligned business models. And so like there's a lot of amazing things that have come out. And then the one example I'll give you to this idea of increasing workload, you can imagine if this opportunistic screening idea, if I've taken a lot of images of a population and I'm able to extract more insights from that, for example, maybe a very highly predictive cardiovascular risk score, and I'm able to cross-match that prediction with patients that have no diagnosis of cardiovascular disease, right? So you're really trying to find this and maybe even say no statin, no preventative care. And my goal of this would be to say, let's refer these patients for cardiovascular preventative care, because I know that the cost of that patient when they come in with their first heart attack, not having had the diagnosis and yet having this high risk, evidence on their imaging, that's a problem. It's a problem for the patient, it's certainly a problem for the health system. But at the same time, the workforce isn't really designed or set up in a way to deal with that influx of new patients that are being now referred for cardiovascular preventative care. So there's definitely use cases like that lead to that problem. But at a macro scale, we are in an interesting kind of challenge, because where the technology is versus where the practice of medicine is, there's some things that you ask yourself, is this how I would design a health system, knowing where the technology is today? I think Troy Tasbas from the FDA often says that it's like we have these Ferraris, but we're still driving them on the 101 in rush hour, in LA.
Oh, yeah.
Like you're still, you have this amazing tool, but you're not getting through to your destination any more quickly than a Pinto or whatever, right? So there's all these kinds of, again, this is part of that misaligned incentives, misaligned infrastructure that I think there's enough incentive now, at least probably more than ever, of the potential to start to move the needle, I think, in terms of rethinking. And you're seeing this really happen with the widespread now use of a new position, the chief AI officer. You may have seen that paper in the New England Journal talking about that. I don't think I know a health system that isn't either hiring for that role or already has that role in place. And really, that's a testament to the fact that this person's job is to figure out, first of all, how do we take the best of the best technology and bring it in, but also how do we redesign and work with the other executives in the health system and stakeholders to maybe refactor this so that we can take advantage of so I'm seeing this start to happen now, to your point, because we can't just throw concrete onto the same processes forever and expect everything to work out.
Well, it's a system, right, of people and computers working together. And just because you have a better model, you have to improve the whole system. So it's a model monitoring and maintenance step. I love the Ferrari metaphor, because making the Ferrari faster on the congested road doesn't.
That's right.
Well, giving a more powerful engine on the congested road doesn't work. Yeah. So you really have to have systemic thinking. We certainly aspire to that, and I think we do that pretty well. So, as a closing thought, because we're out of time, Marie, maybe we could alert everybody to the fact that our next guest, and I think you're going to find this interesting, Matt, is Olivia Gambelin, author of Responsible AI. So that gets into the issue of AI ethics. So maybe just as we're out of time, but maybe as a closing thought, is AI ethics working its way into medical education? There's probably not a lot of room for any extra topics, but if physicians are going to be using these systems, it's going to be something that's on their plate.
Yeah, no, I mean, bias and inherent, challenges, both with just the digital divide, but then also how that relates to access to the best technologies, and then the biases of the system, because maybe they were built on populations that don't reflect the on the ground population. All those challenges, we definitely bring that up as in every course that we build, and of course the things that we do. But you can't overemphasize it. In fact, it's critical, and I think any education effort that is going to bring AI to a new domain, particularly in healthcare, this has to be at the top of the list of things that get covered. You have to have a healthy respect for the potential bias, both on the part of the, the technology, but then also your own biases and things like automation bias and confirmation bias, all those things that humans are subject to as well. That combination can be problematic if you're not aware of it.
Yeah, you mentioned the CAIO role. Another role is the AI ethicist role, which 5 years ago we probably wouldn't have contemplated having someone in that role. But if that also includes things like keeping up with the AI regulation stuff, it becomes a substantial, part-time or full-time role. We have 2 consultants that are AI strategists, and part of that responsibility is this piece of it. Obviously, I could keep on throwing questions your way for another hour. It's been really remarkable. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you enjoy CES, and the conversation will likely continue in the feed. So perhaps periodically check in on that. But again, thanks again so much.
Thanks, Keith. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.